Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Beitzah Daf Lamed Daled contains one Mishnah, which divides the Daf neatly in half. The first half of the Daf is discussing what happens when you heat things up, and if they're made out of earthenware, they may become hardened, or they may break. Either way, you have a potential problem involved, and we'll discuss what the problem is, and then bring a list of halachas that are related. Then the Mishnah will introduce to us the topic of somebody who is setting aside fruits to eat tomorrow, but they are mukta today. Does that work, and what are the potential issues involved with that? So let's begin the daf. We've seen in our last Mishnah that you should not heat a bunch of shingles in order to roast or fry something on those shingles. So Gemara wants to know what's the problem. This is referring to Yontif. Why can't you heat up a bunch of shingles and fry something on it? What's the issue? You're allowed to cook on Yontif. What's potentially the problem? So the Gemara gives two answers. Rav Yechon says we're talking about new shingles where we haven't checked their strength, and therefore they may end up cracking if you heat them up. That would mean that you can't roast anything on it, and you just did all that work for nothing. You ended up violating an isser of doing tircha on Yontif without any constructive reason. So you want to first make sure that they are going to survive the procedure, and that's why it's forbidden. The Gemara's second answer is that they may become hardened by the heating process. When you fire clay, that's what makes it be harder. So if you have clay shingles, you're going to fire them and heat them up. Now the Gemara brings two other sugyas which circle back around to this question of what's the problem with heating up the shingles. The first one is slaughtering an animal which was either stepped on or thrown against the wall or dropped from a height. Now the halacha is that there's two potential treifa issues there. Number one is that it may be injured internally. For that, you have to check it. You have to look inside and see if there are any injuries. Besides that, there's an issue of a drasa, which is a treifa that you cannot see. Even if you do a full check and you see there's no injuries, there still may be something called drasa. We call it nafula. Nafula is the name of that treifa. It's one of the 18 treifas. In order to get out of that, the animal either has to live for 24 hours or it has to walk for amas, and then you will know that it's not nafula. Either way, the Gemara does say that you do have to check it. Now the Gemara asks in the sugi there, it's a Gemara in Chulin, the Gemara asks, what about on Yom Tov? Can you shech this animal on Yom Tov? And the question is, since I have to check it, I may do shechita, which is only permitted on Yom Tov if I'm going to eat the animal. And when I open up, I'll find out that it's treif. So am I allowed to do that or not? So the Gemara says you can bring a proof from our case over here. We see that you're not supposed to heat up the shingles because they may break and it'll turn out that you did nothing. You'll be checking it to see if it will break, but you don't know that it will survive. The same issue is over there. You're slaughtering the animal and you don't know that it will be functional. So just like it's usher over there, it should be usher over here. So Gemara says the one who asked the question didn't feel like that was a good proof because he learned the problem with the shingles case wasn't that it might break. He learned the second option. The problem with the shingles case was that you're hardening it, and therefore that something may break or may be treif, and your tircha that you're doing may be for nothing. He did not consider that part of this discussion. Therefore, he still had that question. Okay, now the Gemara's second discussion, which relates to this here, is a discussion of what happens when a bunch of different people bring items to contribute to a cooking process. So first of all, there's a contradiction between two brises. We're going to have to resolve that first. But what happens when a bunch of different people bring a different thing? So one brisa says, the two brises are both discussing where one person brings a flame, one brings wood, one brings a pot to put on top of the wood, one brings water to fill the pot, one brings spices to put in the pot, and one stirs the pot. All these different people. One brisa says they're all violating an issur d'oraisa if they do this on Shabbos, let's say. And the other says only the person who brings the fire. So how could that be? So Gemara says simple. If the fire is there first, so then everything that adds an isser. The person who puts wood in the fire violates mavir. The person who brings the fire also violated an isser because it becomes greater or smaller as he's carrying it. Then there's the isser of putting the pot on the fire. Then there's the isser of putting the water in the pot, that's cooking. Then there's putting food, that's also cooking. And then there's stirring, which adds to the cooking itself. Now, if the fire was brought last, so everything else was set up with no flame, so there's no isser involved. Nobody did anything. Until you light the fire under the pot with the water and the spices in it, there's nothing to be done. So, therefore, that's why that in that case, the brisa that says that the only person who violates any issues when it brings the flame is when everything else was done first. Either way, the Gemara is wondering what is the issur that was done by the person who brings the pot. You just put a pot. You don't cook when you put a pot on a fire. So Gemara says, like we're saying here, it's like the issur of putting the shingles in the fire. Just like putting shingles in the fire hardens it. Over there, putting the pot in the fire hardens it. And it's usur for any of the two reasons. Either because you may check it and it has to crack, or because you put the pot in the fire and it has to harden. Okay, now the Gemara brings a couple of brises with a few lists of halachos, one of which includes things relative to our hardening the shingles case. So the first brisa says that an oven or a stove which has never been cooked in before is not muktzah. They are perfectly good kalim. You're allowed to move them around in the chatzar. However, you should not smear them with oil. That helps the hardening process. You should not brush them or buff them with a cloth. You shouldn't coat them in cold water. That also helps the hardening. And if you do the cold water on the outside of the oven in order to help the bread that's baking in it, that's permitted. Rashi explains that you have a fire in there and you have bread in there and it's baking and it's on yantiv. But you realize the fire is too hot and the bread's going to burn before the inside gets baked. So what you do is you pour cold water on the outside of the oven to cool the situation off. So that is permitted as part of the baking process. Okay, now we get to our next brisa. This discusses removing the hair or the feathers from animals and birds. So it says you're allowed to put the head of an animal into hot water. You're allowed to put the legs into hot water. You're allowed to wave them in a flame. What you cannot do is scrape them with shards of pottery or with earth or coat them with lime or cut them with scissors. You also can't cut the bad parts off a vegetable by cutting them off. You also can't cut those off with a pair of scissors. You are allowed to fix a kudnis and achbios, two types of vegetables that have kind of like hair on them. You have to be removed. You are allowed to light a fire in a big oven called a porni. You don't have to worry that it's too big and it's too much work and you don't need all that. That's permitted. You're allowed to heat water in a device called an antichi. That's like a copper tank with coals that go in a compartment in the bottom. You're not allowed to, however, bake in a new porni because that might break. And that's, again, similar to our case of the Ra'af. Okay, next brisa. You're not allowed to blow into a blow stick like the kind the glass blowers use, but you are allowed to blow into a tube. You're not allowed to sharpen and fix and prepare a spit to be used for the third time, and you can't sharpen it. Another brisa, you're not allowed to split reeds in order to put on top of a grill so that you can roast fish on it without burning the fish. But you are allowed to split walnuts in a cloth. You don't have to be afraid that the cloth is going to tear from the walnuts. And if it will tear, it's not a problem because it's not what you intended and it's not awesome. Okay, this takes us to our Mishnah. This Mishnah discusses a topic which is only really tangentially related to our Sugya, our Masechta. It's discussing somebody who has fruits that he set out in his yard to dry. And he wants to eat them on Shabbos. So he sets aside a certain part of it and says, I plan to eat those on Shabbos. And the question is he permitted to eat them or not? Now it's being quoted here because it's a muktzah-related issue, and it's the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, who was quoted in the last Mishnah. So what are the issues here? He has these fruits that are drying in his yard, and he wants to say, I'm going to eat from these tomorrow. Is he allowed to eat them or not? So it's a machlokes Rabbi Eliezer and the Chamim. Rabbi Eliezer says he's allowed to, and the Chamim say he has to mark off exactly which fruits he wants to eat. But again, what are the issues? So there's two issues. Muktzah, and there's a couple of muktzah issues involved, and then there's meiser issues. Now, muktzah, first things first. First of all, these fruits are drying. Drying fruits that are in the middle of the drying process are usually considered to be muktzah. They're not edible while they're half dried. If they're fresh, they're edible. If they're fully dried, they're edible. If they're half dried, they're somewhat edible. So the Gemara here is referring to a situation in which you could be somebody who eats them. It depends on whether you want to eat them or not. And therefore, if he sets aside that he wants to eat them, he says, I plan to eat these, that's not a muktzah issue. However, there's another potential muktzah issue, and that's if it's not meiser, which we'll get to at the end of the Gemara. If it's chayiv in meiser, but it's not meisered yet, then you can't eat it because it's tevel. That could potentially make it muktzah. Now, what's the meiser issues here? So as follows. Fruits are only chayiv in meiser once they enter the house. These fruits never entered the house. Fruits are also chayiv in meiser only once they are completed in their work. These are being dried out, so they're not finished being dried out yet. And there are two other potential ways to make fruits chayiv in meiser. One is if they're set aside for Shabbos food. And another potential issue, another way to make it chayv meiser. But a potential issue is it a year which has meiser at all? The Shemitah year doesn't have meiser issues altogether. There's no meiser during Shemitah. So this Mishnah says we're talking about Shemitah fruits. It seems to imply that if not for the fact that it would be Shemitah fruits, it would be chayv meiser, or would become chayv meiser on Shabbos, and you wouldn't be able to eat them because they now became chayv meiser on Shabbos. You can't take meiser on Shabbos. Now, why would they become chayv meiser on a Shabbos? The implication would seem to be that they're not chayv meiser for being brought into the house because they weren't brought into the house yet. They're not chayv meiser for being completed in their work and being brought into the house because they aren't completed in their work yet. They're still drying. They'll finish drying to the appropriate stage of drying on Shabbos, and then they'll become chayv meiser, and then you won't be able to take meiser. So therefore, that's why the Mishnah has to be. The Mishnah specifically discusses a case when it's Shemitah. That way, it'll become. It'll never have an issue of meiser. Now, another potential way that it becomes chayv meiser is the fact that you're setting aside for Shabbos food. Shabbos food is meiser. So the Gemara is going to try to figure out which of these is the correct approach. And the Gemara begins by quoting a Mishnah elsewhere, that there's a concept that Shabbos food, setting aside something for Shabbos food, makes it chayv meiser. The Gemara quotes a Beitzah that says that if children hide figs in the field, and they hide it for the purpose of using it for Shabbos, and they don't end up using it on Shabbos, they can't eat it after Shabbos. The reason is because it's chayv meiser because it was Shabbos food. Now, this teaches us that if you set aside food for Shabbos, even if it has never been brought into the house, it's chayv meiser. So now we know, bringing food into the house makes it chayv meiser, as long as it was finished and completed in its work. Setting aside for Shabbos food also makes it chayv meiser. In this case, though, is also that it was completed its work. So being brought into the house or setting aside for Shabbos food without being brought into the house, both of those make fruits chayv meiser as long as its work was finished. It was fully processed. The Gemara says, Rava asked the question of Rav Nachman, does Shabbos food, does setting aside for Shabbos food, make it chayv meiser if it wasn't fully processed? It was still in the drying process and it wasn't fully finished. Does that make it chayv meiser or not? And now, Rava's question is fleshed out because we have another Mishnah that says that if you bring fruits into your chutzner, into your yard, which is considered like you brought into your house, but it wasn't fully processed, it wasn't fully dried, it's not chayv meiser. So bringing fruits into your yard will only make it chayv meiser if it's fully processed. The question is, what about Shabbos? The Shabbos, making it Shabbos food, does that make it chayv meiser only if it's fully processed, or even if it's not fully processed? And Rav Nachman answered that Shabbos works to make it chayv meiser even if it's not fully dried, not fully processed. So Gemara said that Rav asked, how do you know? Maybe it's like a chutzner. Just like a chutzner only works on fully processed, maybe Shabbos also only works if it's fully processed. So he said we have a Messiah, we have a limit of Aruch, we have a Messiah that this works whether it's fully processed or not. So the Gemara says, Marzusha wants to say that, and this is Marzusha, the son of Rav Nachman, who's the one who said this, you can prove it from our Mishnah as well. Where do you see this in the Mishnah? Because the Mishnah says that it had to be Shemitah. It was a Shemitah year. The reason why it said Shemitah year is because it must be, says Marzusha, because otherwise it would be chayv meiser. But why is it chayv meiser? It wasn't finished drying out, and you didn't bring it into the house. The only thing you did was make it Shabbos food. So obviously Shabbos food makes it chayv meiser even if it's not fully dried. Setting aside for Shabbos food makes it chayv meiser. So the Gemara says, no, maybe not. Maybe the reason why it's chayv meiser is because the guy said, I plan on eating it. He said, I intend on eating it. And by setting it aside and saying, I'm going to eat this, he showed that it's finished the process. The process is over. And it's got nothing to do with the fact that it's Shabbos food. So if that's true, so why does it say that it wasn't Shabbos? Why do you have to say that this is a case of Erev Shabbos? The Mishnah specifically said that it wasn't Erev Shabbos. Teach me that halacha even during the week. The Gemara answers, we talked about Shabbos in order to teach me the halacha that if somebody fixes food on Shabbos, he separates meiser on Shabbos, it's not considered to be muktzah from the fact that it was tevel before. Therefore, this Mishnah specifically discusses a case of tevel, so that even if it was tevel in the beginning of Shabbos, that itself doesn't make it meiser. The fact that it was not fully dried, that's why it's meiser. That's why it was muktzah. But the fact that it was tevel didn't make it muktzah, and if somebody were to separate it on Shabbos, it wouldn't be an issue.
Drive Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.